Coming back to this issue of the personal sense of consciousness and the idea of limitation, and then going beyond the thinking portion of that into the feeling portion of separation. The feeling at its core, it's very strange. It's a feeling that the world is not safe. It's not safe for me to let go of this. At its very core, the world is not a safe place. And you've heard that come up a number of times in this. I don't know if this is unique to me or if it's unique to humans in general, but somehow the most that I can do in that is to allow it to dance and to be and to do whatever it's going to do and to witness it as it arises, and to realize also that as it arises, it passes. And that it becomes fainter and fainter. But that in some way that there is a very deep core feeling that stands in between that and this beingness, which would be that baseline, that sort of holds back. And there's a tremendous amount of fear about not being safe going the direction that I'm going.
The feeling that the world is not safe is the corollary to the feeling that I, this little entity, am vulnerable, and that when this sensation called the body disappears, that I am going to disappear with it. So it's essentially the fear of nothingness. But it is your experience that the sensation of the body disappears regularly. Is it so traumatic to fall asleep? Is it so traumatic when the sensation of the body disappears?
Or even during the waking state, when something hurts here and then later on it doesn't hurt there anymore, it hurts over here or it itches back here. But it's constantly changing. There's nothing static about any portion of it.
Yes. And the fear comes from the very, very deep association of consciousness with the body. We think that as the body disappears, I'm going to disappear with it. Consciousness is going to disappear with it. And that's where the fear comes from. And the feeling that the world is hostile and dangerous comes essentially from this core belief that this tiny, vulnerable fragment of a body, when it goes, I, this knowing presence, am going to go with it. So if we stay at that place, because what you're experiencing is the core association, the core exclusive association of consciousness with the body. But if we stay there, if we don't avoid that discomfort and cover it over with other activities and objects that ensure that we don't feel this, but if we have the courage and the patience to stay at that uncomfortable place and just allow the reality of the experience to reveal itself. And the reality of the experience is that this knowing presence is not exclusive. This sensation, it's just a sensation.
The cyclic experience of this becomes less and less because it's witnessed more and more. And somewhere along the way, there's an awakening to the fact that that which is witnessing it is not it.
Just the fact of witnessing it, it's loosening the exclusive identification. Just simply sitting with it and seeing, allowing the bodily sensation to be whatever it is, and allowing it to do its thing with absolutely no agenda. I mean, why have an agenda about a bodily sensation?
Right.
And it's not necessary to get rid of it because it's a sensation. It's not a problem. It's only a problem when it's half seen, when it's believed to be what we are. And therefore, it's felt that when it disappears, we're going to disappear.
Right.
So it's only lack of clarity, lack of clear seeing for what is actually a neutral bodily sensation to become an abode of fear.
Right. The interesting thing that you talked about is the avoidance of this emotional signature or this discomfort. I think it's a more primeval motivation behind a lot of the behavior that I've experienced throughout my entire life. The avoidance of that discomfort manifests itself in overeating, watching too much television, reading too much, doing anything but being present with that which is there, asking to be noticed, okay? And so a huge chunk of my life spent involved in all these activities which are designed to do exactly what you were talking about, which is avoiding this signature, which is sitting at the core of what's going on.
Yeah, the types of activities you're describing are strategies of avoidance.
They're all strategies
of avoiding this discomfort. Once we've seen that, it becomes impossible to engage in them with the kind of conviction we used to. They may go on, there may be the impulse.
There's sort of ghostly impulses or conditions.
And then a time comes when we catch ourselves red-handed, about to embark on one of these, and we know it's not because we want X. What we're really doing is we're
avoiding
and just seeing that is all that's necessary to let this avoiding activity, we just don't go down that road. We just have the courage to stay. And then as we just stay, as we have the courage and the patience to stay with the discomfort, the experience is revealed just as it's a neutral bodily sensation. The discomfort aspect of the experience fades. And it doesn't fade because we're trying to do anything about it, because we're trying to get rid of it. In fact, precisely the opposite. It begins to fade because it's allowed to be what it is. It's simply seen clearly for what it is. It's a bodily sensation. You're not going to disappear or change when it disappears or changes.
It's motivated at a core level by a very, very deep belief that I'm vulnerable and that I'm separate.
Yes.
In spite of the evidence to the contrary.
But every time we go in our experience, both through thinking and through feeling, to the knowing and feeling understanding that what we are is this presence, when we explore it at a rational level, but also when we explore it at a feeling level, and we come through both channels to the feeling understanding, to the knowing, feeling understanding that what we are is this presence, the power of the mind and the power of the body to veil this presence gets weaker and weaker. And without our knowing it, we're just establishing ourselves as this presence. I'm not suggesting there is an I that gets established in presence. This presence becomes more knowingly and confidently itself. The mind no longer veils itself from itself through beliefs, and it no longer veils itself from itself through feelings. And a certain portion of our thoughts and a certain portion of our feelings then stop appearing, because the only reason they appeared in the first place was to substantiate this belief and feeling and separation. As we take our stand more and more as presence, the thoughts and the feelings that were required to maintain this sense of separation drop away. Everything else carries on as before, but without this separate self-reference all the time.
Tremendous amount of effort involved in maintaining a separate sense of self.
Absolutely.
The more you realize,
it's full-time.
It's aging us, no doubt.
Yes, a tremendous effort is required to maintain the belief and the feeling in separation, whereas no effort is required at all to be present.
To be what you are.
Because it's what we are. So this investigation at the level of the mind and the exploration at the level of the body, it may appear to be a doing, an effort. From the limited point of view of the separate entity, it appears to be something that we do.
It's an appearance, of doing this.
But the more it changes, at a certain stage it changes, and it's not something that we're doing. What's actually happening is that something that we were previously doing and that we were unaware of is unwinding. The tight knot of separation, the contraction, is relaxing. And this deep relaxing, what appears to be a doing to begin with, in the end, it's the relaxation, the cessation of a doing. And the presence, which was always there underneath, is always effortlessly itself. It's truly an effortless, pathless path.
It's beautiful. And this is where I want to go with you next, which is this whole idea of the contraction, this squeeze down.
Yes.
To be separate, to be contained within the body to be this
Yes.
individual entity.
Yes. We've become so accustomed to this effort that we have to make to contract that we've forgotten even that we're making an effort. We are used to this burden of separation, and we've become so accustomed to it that we no longer feel even that it's an effort. In fact, it feels so natural that we think,
that relaxing feels unnatural.
Exactly. So that relaxing the effort feels as if it's an activity. It's not. We just become aware of the previous activity that we had forgotten we were maintaining.
Okay, so we sort of come around now to an interesting idea of contraction, of fragmentation, of the feeling of separation, how it manifests in thinking, how it manifests in feeling, how we experience this thing of separation, the suffering that goes on as a result of it all. And then your book goes into this great discussion, quite a bit of the book actually, on what is meditation and what we experience when we meditate. This chapter is called Consciousness Shines in Every Experience, which is a beautiful name. And it starts out, meditation is not an activity. It is a cessation of an activity. And then it goes on to say, in order to understand that meditation is not an activity, we can use the example of a clenched fist. If we take our open hand and slowly close it tightly, an effort is required both to clench the hand and to maintain it in that contracted gesture. So go ahead and let's talk about that one for a little bit. And then I've got some famous quotes here from you on this that I think, because this really fit for me, this whole idea of contraction and the effort required to maintain this whole belief in separation. And the pain that I experience as a result of trying to maintain this whole spinning plates on top of, like those guys in the circus do, spinning the plates, hundreds of plates. Got to keep it all going.
Yes, I think the image of a clenched fist is a good one, because if we clench our fist and we leave it clenched for a long time, a habit in the muscles forms, and we forget that an effort is being exerted in order to maintain. We just think that this is natural. This is the natural position of the hand. Now, if we've maintained our hand in this position, in this gesture, say for a few weeks or a few months or a few...
50 years,
or 50 years, for instance.
For instance.
And someone was then to say to us, now, unclench your fist, we would feel that a great effort was being made to unclench the fist, because by that time we would think the clenched fist is the natural state and the open hand is a new state that is achieved as a result of making a tremendous effort to open the hand. But that's only because we have forgotten. We have become so accustomed to the gesture of the clenched fist that we have forgotten that we are actually maintaining it through effort. So if that's the case, if we have forgotten that we are making this unconscious gesture, then of course the effort to release the hand seems to require an effort. It becomes apparent after a while that in fact it is not a new effort that is being applied in order to open the hand. It is the relaxation of a previous unnoticed effort. It's a nice description of meditation. Once we deeply think and feel that what we are is a separate entity, then meditation seems to be an activity, an effort to somehow attain a new state in exactly the same way that the opening of the hand seems to require a new effort in order to arrive at a new experience. However, that's only the case, it's only relatively true. It's true from the perspective of the apparent separate entity, where we have forgotten that what we actually are is this open, free, unlimited consciousness, equally one moment by moment with the totality of what is, not inherently associated with a fragment. But we have forgotten this, and this open, free, unlimited oneness has contracted upon a cluster of sensations. It has clenched itself, it has contracted, but it's become so used to that, it no longer feels, we no longer even notice that this is something that we are doing, that it's an activity. We think that it is an entity. The person is not an entity, it is an activity. But it's an activity that we've become so accustomed to that we no longer notice it, that it's an activity, and we think it is the natural state, that it is an entity. So, of course, once this deep belief, and more importantly, the deep feeling, has taken root in us, that I am this contracted entity, then, of course, to recover what seems to be lost, to recover what is, in fact, the natural, underlying, ever-present condition, which is the open. It seems that we have to make a tremendous effort to decontract, to let go of, and this is
To learn how to let go.
And this is the apparent activity of meditation. Actually, what happens when we begin, and it doesn't matter if we think it's an activity. We think it's a doing, an activity. It's fine. It doesn't matter what we call it. We embark on this so-called effort, this so-called doing, and we realize very quickly that actually it's not the case at all. There's no question of doing anything. We were doing something before. We were doing this self-contraction before, and that what we thought was the activity of meditation is actually simply a relaxation of what we were doing before. And in this process, a kind of switch takes place at some stage when it becomes clear to us that we are not this separate entity making a terrific effort in order to become this open, free, unlimited presence, but we are always and only and already this open, free, unlimited presence, which was, up until now, doing this activity of separation and is beginning
not to allow.
So in that sense, this open, free, unlimited presence just remains as it is. It stops superimposing a belief and a feeling on top of itself, within itself, and begins to re-experience itself as it is. So to begin with, we think that meditation is an activity. Later, we understand that it's not an activity, it is the cessation of an activity. But later, we see that it's not even the cessation of an activity, because we realize that consciousness, presence, this open, free, unlimited presence, is always only itself. So then we understand that what could be called the highest form of meditation is simply the abidance as what we are, being what we are. There's nothing to do, there's nothing to be, there's nothing to become, because we understand and we feel that what we are is this presence, in which and ultimately as which the totality of our experience is expressing itself. So then there's a switch. We used to think that the person is what we are and that meditation is something that we do. We then understand completely the opposite. Meditation, contemplation, is what we are, and the person is something that we do from time to time.
Here's a couple notes that you said, this because it's so poetically written. This free, open, unlimited consciousness has contracted upon itself. It has seemingly shrunk itself into the narrow frame of a body and a mind, and limited itself to a tiny location in a vast space and into a brief moment in an endless expanse of time. This is the primary self-contraction that open, free, unlimited consciousness chooses from moment to moment of its own free will. Feeling itself isolated and therefore vulnerable and afraid, this open, free, unlimited consciousness now sets about supporting and protecting its new self-imposed identity as a fragment. To effect this, it reinforces its boundaries with layer upon layer of contraction. At the level of the mind, these contractions are made out of desires and addictions on one hand, and resistances, fears, and rejections on the other. These are the many faces of our likes and dislikes, the I want and I don't want. I think it's pretty remarkable stuff. So starting from the trunk of the tree, which is the belief in separation, comes the tree and all the branches and all the various behaviors, beliefs, desires, and fears.
In that way, that the sense of separation grows roots. It's not just the primary self-contraction. Consciousness contracts onto it and feels that I am a sensation, but there are many sensations in the body, some of them very, very subtle, with which it identifies. And not only that, it then builds belief upon belief. I'm not just a separate entity, but I'm a man. I'm not just a man, but I'm a man of X years old, of this kind of intelligence, of this kind. So the primary belief is then expanded upon.
Right.
So the belief grows, spawns other beliefs, and the feeling as well. There are lots and lots of locations. So the sense of separation ends up as a very dense network, a fabric that's made of desires. It's not just a single, there's a single belief that is at its core, the core self-contraction, the core feeling that I am separate.
Separate sense of me.
But that is substantiated and supported by a whole kind of edifice of secondary beliefs which give it seeming depth and solidity.
Now, a guy that we both know, Francis Lucille, talks a lot about dealing with these beliefs, dealing with all these little offshoots one at a time, in which case you'll be pruning the tree for the rest of your life, or ultimately going directly to the core belief and dealing with the core belief, which is the belief in a separate sense of me. At the level of the body, these contractions are made out of bodily sensations with which consciousness identifies itself. They are the apparent location of I inside the body. So this is getting back now to your thing that this whole tree or this fabric of beliefs extends all the way into bodily sensations, and that those bodily sensations reinforce the belief that we're located within the body.
Yes, the separate self is like a woven fabric. The warp is made of beliefs, and the weft is made of sensations, and they're kind of mutually supported. They both seem to support and substantiate each other, so that it's woven together into a very coherent, convincing fabric that makes us feel, yes, this separate sense is absolutely real. Yeah. It's consistent. There is a consistency to the fabric of the self, which gives us great conviction in its reality.
It goes on here. I'm just going to read a little more of your stuff and get your comments on this. As a result of consciousness contracting upon itself and imagining itself to be a fragment in this way, it projects outside of itself everything that is not contained within the boundary of its own self-imposed and limited identity. We discussed this. The world becomes a vast and potentially threatening container of this consciousness as a fragment. We also talked about my experience with exactly that. Ironically, it is precisely because the world is, in reality, an appearance in consciousness and an expression of it, that it so accurately reflects the ideas that consciousness entertains about it. That's an interesting statement. If consciousness believes itself to be a fragment, to be limited, to be bound, and to appear in time and space, then the world will appear as the counterpart of that fragment. Having denied itself its own birthright, its own eternal, all-pervading status, consciousness confers the same status on the world of appearances. It forgoes its own reality as the ground and nature of all experience, and instead projects its own creation onto the world of appearances. Consciousness exchanges its nature with the world of appearances. It has no alternative but to do this.
Yes. Consciousness knows itself to be the ever-present reality of experience. But at a certain stage, it contracts upon a fragment. Instead of being equally one with the totality of experience, it singles out a little cluster. It draws a line in the sand of experience, so to speak, and it says everything on this side of the line is what I am. And by definition, everything that's on the other side becomes what I am not. Yes? So the line in the sand is the body, the feeling. So it says, I am all these bodily sensations. And therefore, everything that is not this bodily sensation, in other words, the world, is everything that I am not. So, in identifying itself with a body, it forgets its ever-present, all-pervading status. It gives it up and exchanges, and instead of feeling that it is ever-present, unlimited, it assumes the characteristics of the body-mind with which it has identified. It no longer thinks and feels, I am ever-present, unlimited. It thinks, I am located and limited. However, inherent in consciousness is ever-presentness. That's what it is. So it has to, in a sense, give its sense of substantiality,
Right.
ever-presentness, to something, because it's given it up. So it says, okay, I'm now caricaturing consciousness. It's as if it were to say, okay, I'm going to give up my birthright as being ever-present, unlimited. I'm going to pretend that I'm this tiny little intermittent spark here. Therefore, it bestows its true nature, its continuous presence, its reality on the world. So then, everything turns around. We think that the world is substantial, real, continuous, ever-present. And we think that consciousness is this little, fragile, intermittent spark. Actually, our true experience is the other way around. Our experience is that consciousness is the ever-present reality of our experience. And we can check that out in our experience. At any moment, consciousness is. We never experience any fragility in consciousness. We never experience consciousness waxing and waning, coming and going, bigger or smaller, more or less clear. Consciousness is. That is our experience, ever present. And the world is actually always fleeting. Take any experience of the world. I mean, how long does any experience of the world last? It lasts for a fraction of a second. Our experience of the world is so fleeting and insubstantial. Likewise, thoughts and sensations. So it is truly the world that is fleeting and insubstantial, and consciousness, which is ever-present and substantial. But we get it completely the wrong way around. Consciousness bestows its own substantiality, its own realness. It gives to the world, to objects, and we think the world is real. And the fleeting, ephemeral nothingness that the world is made of, consciousness assumes for itself, and it thinks, I'm nothing, I'm non-existent, I'm so vulnerable, I die, I can disappear, I change. It's the other way around. And it's our experience, actually. If we look at our experience, this isn't a new state. It's just what I'm describing is actually our natural moment-by-moment experience. But we have so profoundly forgotten this, so profoundly forgotten that the actual reality, the substance of the so-called world, is actually the substance of ourself, of presence. that the world has no other reality other than the presence we give it.
That's beautiful.
If anyone were to ask themselves, what is my experience of the world? What would my experience of the world be if consciousness were to be withdrawn from it? What is my experience outside without consciousness?
There is none.
There is none. Exactly.
Having conceptualized itself, consciousness, into a limited and separate entity, it has to account for its intimate experience of presence, of being elsewhere. And hence, it confers on the world, on other. In short, consciousness creates an appearance that is consistent with its own belief. In fact, the belief of itself as a limited fragment and the, quote, appearance of the world as a solid and separate entity are co-created as a seamless, mutually validating whole.
Yes.
It comes back again to the same concept. I mean, the same thing that you can't have a separate person without
Exactly.
a world. It's all one thing.
Once the oneness of consciousness being is artificially separated, appears to be separated into a subject and an object, into knowing and being, into the knower and the known, then these apparent two are two sides of the same coin. Once consciousness has assumed that it is this little fragment here, by definition, everything that is not this little fragment becomes everything that I am not.
So it projects the characteristics that it needs to get rid of itself in order to play the separation game.
If you imagine a screen, and there's an image on the screen, there are lots of people and objects and landscape, and it's as if the screen were to say, at one moment, instead of feeling itself to be the background and substance of the totality of the appearance, it is as if the screen were to say, I am not the totality of the image that is appearing at the moment. I am just one of the people that is appearing. And automatically, as it feels that everything that is not this single person is everything that is not me.
Mm-hmm. Still has to account for everything else, and that everything else has to be the not me.
Yes.
And the not me, by virtue of the size and scope of it, has to be more powerful than the little me.
Yes, because the little me is, in our experience, is simply a sensation, and that sensation is coming and going. So consciousness has allied itself to a sensation that is
coming and going.
Mm-hmm. So
and changing all the time.
It feels, and every time a sensation goes, it dies, it's gone forever. It's not the same sensation that comes back. It's a new sensation. It's only a concept that links the sensations together. The concept is, I'm a body that's made out of all these changing. So once consciousness has allied itself to a fleeting sensation, it feels, as the sensation disappears, that it disappears. Mm-hmm. So it feels itself very vulnerable, and quite right too, because if it thinks it's a sensation, it's quite right. It is coming and going. It is vulnerable. It is fleeting. It is so insubstantial. It's just vanishing every moment. And therefore, everything else, everything outside this little fleeting sensation, seems to be threatening it all the time. It's not threatening it at all. It is as much a part of consciousness. One person on this side of the screen is not threatening another person on this side. They're both on the same screen. They're both part of the same image. It's actually only one image. It's not one thing as opposed to another. It's one totality.
Yeah.
But as we contract upon ourselves and feel that we are fragile and vulnerable, we automatically think that everything else is powerful and threatening. And the world then becomes hostile and unfriendly.
Wow. That is a way at looking at the movement from totality to separation and back again that I've never heard expressed that way, ever. Wonderful. We sort of come back now to this idea of sort of summarizing what is the nature of our experience. So why don't we start taking a look at that and see where that whole chain of thought really takes us in summary.
The normal view of our experience is that I, and when we say I, we mean this body-mind, experiences a world. Nearly every formulation of our experience is conceived in those terms. I, this body-mind, experiences something or someone. I love so-and-so. I see the tree. So-and-so does this. Our experience is conceived as a subject doing or experiencing or knowing an object. So this is considered to be so obviously and fundamentally true as not to need investigation. Any investigation that takes place tends to take place with this as the basic presumption. So before we add anything to that idea, we look at that fundamental idea and just simply measure our current experience with that formulation and say, is this true? Is this a true premise?
Right.
And just the one look at experience shows us that this basic idea, this basic attitude of experience is just so far from the actual reality of our experience. Because if we look at the world, we say, yes, the world is experienced. I experience the world. I'm experiencing this room, the sky, the field. But then, do we not also experience the body? Yes.
Right.
Do we not experience the mind? Yes. It's not the body experiences the world. We, and whatever we are at this stage, we're not saying what we are, but whatever it is that experiences, yes, it experiences the world, but it also experiences this body. Even if we take a look at the visual field now, the body, or part of the body, is as much a part of the visual world as the carpet and the room and the trees. This body, this leg, is not perceiving the world. The world, plus this body, and this mind, is being perceived. So whatever it is that we are, whatever it is that experiences or knows experience, is not a body or a mind. The body and the mind are known by it, in the same way that the world is known by it. So immediately we see that the body-mind is not the subject of experience and the world the object of that experience, but rather I, whatever I am. And let's leave that completely undefined at the moment. We just know that it is something that experiences, something that is conscious. That this I experiences the body, the mind, and the world. So that immediately leaves open the question, what then is this I? Whatever it is, it's what I am, because it's undoubted fact of my experience now that I, whatever I am experiencing something. We don't even need to know what the nature of that something is at the moment. It may be, for instance, a dream or a hallucination. We're not going so far as to say what it is, but it's something. There is some experience going on, and there is something which we call I, which is experiencing. Now, what is that? If we look at that and try to find what that is, what can we know for sure about it? First of all, if we look at experience, it becomes very clear that there is something which is conscious, and that is what I am. That is what we are. Whatever it is that is hearing these words, that is seeing these sights, that is feeling the temperature of the air, whatever that is, it's conscious.
Right. I exist.
I am, and I am conscious. Hence, it's often called consciousness, that which is conscious. And we are that before we are a body. The body is experienced by that. So it's very clear from looking directly at our experience in this moment that what we are is this knowing, this conscious presence, whatever it is. Once we've established that, we can then go further and say, okay, well, what is this? We know that it is, but what is it? And so we start to look for it. And a very interesting thing happens, because it is our actual experience in this moment that this I is present. That is a direct experience. And yet if we look for it, we find nothing objective. Because if it was anything objective, if it had any qualities of mind or body or whatever those objective qualities were, that would immediately put it on the experienced side. Whatever those qualities were would be experienced.
Because something would be observing it.
Something,
Yeah.
which is this observing I. So if we continue to look for it in this way, anything that comes up that says, yes, I am this, it might be a sensation in the body, it might be whatever it is, we can immediately say, well, hang on a minute, I am seeing that thing, I am conscious of it, I am aware of it. So it immediately puts some distance between this knowing presence and that which is known. So very quickly, we come to these two very clear certainties about what we are. We debunk what turns out to be false certainties about what we are, and we come very clearly to see that we are present, that is undoubted, we are knowing, we are that which knows or experiences, but also that whatever that is has no objective qualities. And that's derived from experience. We've just conducted the experiment, we've just looked at whatever it is, tried to find whatever it is, and seen that it has no objective qualities. So if that is the case, and that is our direct experience in this moment, if that's the case, what makes us so sure, for instance, that it is limited? Anything that's limited, we know that it's limited because we see the end of it. We say, yes, this chair is here, but it's not there. The chair is limited. So if we apply the same criteria to this knowing presence, we've said already that it has no objective qualities. Any limit would be, by definition, an objective quality that we could observe, like the edge of this chair or the end of this sentence. We find no such objective quality. So the idea that I, what we are, is limited is simply that. It's just an idea that just through very, very simply looking at what we are and sticking very, very closely just to our experience, we find that there's nothing in our experience to validate the belief, the deep-seated belief that we have that I is limited and therefore personal.
Just come to the conclusion, first of all, that the subject is not the body-mind.
Yes.
First, that it's not the body, and then ultimately, as we observe our thoughts and feelings and sensations and all that, if I'm observing it, it can't be me. And then you come to this conclusion, which sounds very simple, that as consciousness, we can't be limited by definition, because if we could see the boundary of consciousness, it would then be observable and therefore could not be us, because we are observing. Now, the implication of what you're saying here is the thing that maybe doesn't begin to sink in until you really start to experientially look at this. This is the point where maybe what we were talking about before, that there's an intellectual understanding. You can take this so far in your thinking and you can say, okay, consciousness is not limited. But my experience of myself, my feeling experience of myself and life, sure feels like I'm sitting inside this body dealing with problems that are appearing all around me at all times. So what's going on?
if we arrive at the conclusion that we've just arrived at, and we're sure that we've arrived at this conclusion that consciousness is undoubtedly present and yet not limited or personal, if we've arrived at that through our own experience, as we have, and not just bought the idea because we've heard it already, but if we really see clearly from our own experience that's the case, we can then experiment with our experience to see how this consciousness, or even if this consciousness, is affected by the changing nature of appearances.
Before you jump on that, I just want to say your mind goes very quickly, and you've assumed part of this line of reasoning that I'm not so sure sinks in so quickly to people, which is to say, consciousness is not limited. I get it. Consciousness is not personal. Would have to flow from that. Now that's the place that I think that it starts to become like, whoa, 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 whoa.
Okay.
I may be consciousness, I may be ephemeral, I may be noumena, I may be all this stuff, but it's still me.
Yes.
Okay? And so we get this defensive ownership quality feeling to what's going on.
So let's look at that. Why the fact that consciousness is not limited means also that it's not personal. Because by personal we mean belonging to the person. And that which defines the person is this particular body and this particular mind, and the mind being a collection of thoughts and memories and desires. And so how can we establish in our experience that consciousness is independent? We've established in our experience that consciousness is what we are. So now let's leave the world on one side for a moment and just look at the relationship between the body and the mind and this knowing presence, I, consciousness. Mm-hmm. And we see, for instance, that there are many times during the day when the body and the mind are not present as an experience. And yet I, this consciousness, doesn't disappear. For instance, in a dream, the mind is present, but the body is simply not present. Right. Of course, I know the objection to that is that, oh, well, the body was actually, it was there, it was lying in the bed because so-and-so saw it. But we're just sticking just with experience. The body is not experienced. And by the body, we mean visual perceptions if our eyes are open, and bodily sensations. Neither of these are present in a dream. So we have the direct experience on a regular basis that I remain as I am, consciousness remains as it is, and that what we call the body comes and goes. Consciousness itself is not affected in any way by the coming and the going of the body. We also experience moments when the mind is not present, when, for instance, there are no thoughts present, or when there are no images. Our experience in that moment may consist of sense perceptions or bodily sensations. There may be no thinking, there may be no mental imagery going on. Exactly the same is true of that state, that consciousness remains exactly as it always is.
Right.
So the appearance and disappearance of thoughts and images, which we call the mind, and bodily sensations, which we call the body, they come and go to this consciousness. They come and go in the same way that objects come and go in this room. Mm-hmm. Now, it's only when consciousness identifies itself, by which I mean when consciousness thinks and feels, I am this little sensation, or this cluster of sensations, or this group of thoughts, that consciousness seems to undergo the changes that the body and the mind undergo. And therefore, when the body and mind disappear, consciousness, because it's welded itself, it's so completely identified itself with the body-mind, it feels that it goes wherever the body-mind goes. That is not true any more than the space in this room moves or changes when the furniture moves and changes. The space was here before this room was full of furniture. In fact, the space was here before the house was built. The house was built, the space remained exactly the same. It appeared to take the shape of the room, but when the house is taken down one day, the space will remain exactly as it always is. And it will become obvious then that it was always there and that it never took the shape of the room. It appeared to take the shape of the room. Exactly the same thing. When the furniture comes in, what happens to the space? Absolutely nothing. It just remains as it is. Like consciousness, it accommodates everything that appears. It says yes, 100% to everything. It embraces everything. But it is at the same time totally unaffected by it. The image that is often used is the mirror. Whatever appears in the mirror, it doesn't matter whether it's the most beautiful object or the most ugly object. It's completely independent. Those differences don't make any difference to consciousness at all, and we can experiment with our experience. For instance, take a very pleasant, positive thought, a beautiful thought, a positive thought. Ask yourself, is consciousness present? Of course consciousness is present. It's there to witness this thought. Now take the meanest, hideous thought you can think of. And does that which is aware of this evil thought, does it change at all? No, it's completely independent.
Right.
The experience that what we are is this knowing presence is so close to us, is so obvious, it's so intimately and obviously what we are, and it is also so obviously independent of the changes, the comings and goings of the body and the mind and the world. It's so simple that we've just not noticed it, and that what we are is this knowing presence that is always in the same place, it's always in the same condition. It's always only itself, just like the space in this room or the mirror is always itself, independent of the coming and going.
So this picture that you're painting is of something which has no attributes.
No objective attributes.
And that's interesting because how could it be personal unless it had attributes?
Exactly.
Objective attributes.
Yes.
Okay, so technically we can buy that, but somehow it still sort of feels as though, from where I'm sitting, that this consciousness belongs to something that's closer to this body than it is to that body, or closer to here than it is to the mountain out there.
Yes.
Now that's an interesting thing, because if in fact that's an illusion, we should be able to experientially sort that out.
Absolutely true. And what we've done so far, in some sense, is to deal with the top layer, the smallest part of the sense that I, this consciousness, am personal and limited. We've dealt with the tip of the iceberg, which is the belief that consciousness is personal.
Now we're going to give ourselves permission to investigate whether or not that's true.
Exactly as you say, we're now left with a contradiction. We've established from our own experience that we know, and when I say know now, I mean we know with the mind that consciousness cannot be personal, and yet we feel, as you say, if we're honest, and yet we feel, yes, I still feel here. I feel that you're over there. So there's a contradiction.
Right, what's going on here?
This contradiction is intolerable for anyone who is interested in the nature, because consciousness cannot be both at the same time. So a deeper level of exploration is initiated by seeing this contradiction, which is an investigation into the feeling. We've established from our own experience that we know that consciousness is not personal, and yet we feel that I, this consciousness, am located here, inside this body, or as this body. So this contradiction is intolerable.
It's either we ignore it, in which case this whole investigation is now becoming a belief as opposed to our direct experience, or we're forced to look more deeply at what's going on, not on the intellectual level anymore, but what's going on the feeling level of how we're experiencing life.
If we only leave it at the intellectual level, if we only leave the understanding And it may be a genuine understanding. Yes, there's nothing in my experience to substantiate the belief that consciousness is personal. Then that is some degree of understanding. But nevertheless, our true feeling is that I am personal. And suffering is inherent in that position. So sooner or later, although we may have a thin layer of understanding, yes, I am impersonal consciousness, sooner or later the feelings are going to percolate up through that thin layer of so-called understanding, and they're going to cause havoc with our life.
There are lessons. I mean, there are lessons to be learned. They're demonstrating that there's something inconsistent with our understanding.
Yes. And sooner or later, this feeling of being located and limited will call for attention. And in most of us, that call for attention comes in the form of unhappiness or
Of course.
suffering.
And we're going to have to confront the fact that this issue has not been resolved to our satisfaction.
Let's look now at the feeling. What does this feeling that I am unlimited consist of? It's a mixture of consciousness, because consciousness is present in every experience. It would be impossible to have an experience without consciousness. So it's a mixture of consciousness plus a collection of sensations, which we call the body. And these two, the feeling I am the body, is the exclusive identification of this knowing consciousness with a cluster of sensations, because that's what the body is. Our experience of the body, if our eyes are closed, our only experience of the body is sensations. Either a single sensation or usually a network, a cluster of sensations. And what we're saying is that I, this knowing presence, is identical with this cluster of sensations, but it is not the sound of the fan over there.
Right.
It's because of this, we're saying that's obvious. You see, what I am, it's obvious to me, I am this cluster of sensation. And it's obvious to me that I am not the fan. Therefore, I am this, me, and I am not that, the world. So the world becomes everything that I am not. Everything that is not this cluster of sensations. That's one way we could define the world.
So how is it now that, as we've come to this conclusion that we're consciousness and that we have really no objective attributes at this point, how is it that we come to judge and categorize the sensations, some as being our own and some of them not our own?
We've just learned to. We've learned, our culture from a very, very early age has conditioned us to believe that we are this fragment. Our actual experience, and in fact, our experience is always that consciousness is one with the totality of our experience. That every experience, the visual perception of something on the horizon, is at the same zero distance from consciousness as the most intimate sensation. Everything is one with consciousness. That is always our experience, even if it seems that it's not. But what's happened is we have been encouraged and educated to think, no, that's not the case. Consciousness is not one with the totality of what is. It's one with a fraction of what is. And we have been rehearsing this for so long that we now think that it's so natural and normal and ordinary that consciousness is exclusively identified with this cluster of sensations, and that therefore consciousness is not everything else. This now becomes the kind of basic assumption of our culture. We mentioned early on, we think it's so obvious. We think it's such an obvious fact of experience that what we are is this body-mind, that sometimes when we hear the kind of reasoning that we've been going through now, people think, oh, no, that's very intellectual and theoretical. And it's the opposite. What's intellectual and theoretical is the idea that this consciousness is exclusively associated with a cluster of sensations. That is truly intellectual. It's never an experience.
So let's look experientially at what you were just talking about. We hear in the distance the fan from the piece of equipment, and at the same time, we feel a bodily sensation in our hands. The question, I guess, is, as I experience both the feeling in my hand and the sound, which appears distant, in reality, are these two sensations and perceptions appearing in the same place, or are they appearing at different places? What's the truth of that in my experience?
Yes.
And the thing that's interesting in that experiment, and this is an experiment that I learned from you and from your book, is that the immediate reaction of the conditioned self is to think that no, this experience that I call my hand, or this feeling, this bodily sensation I feel in my hand, is closer to me than the sound of this fan, which is across the room. And it takes time of sitting with that, really in silence, to realize that, you know something, that's not what's really going on.
Yes.
That the sound of this fan is going on in the identical space that the feeling is that I attribute with my hand. It's like either a sorting process that happens after the fact, or it's some kind of optical illusion, or it's some kind of an illusory thing that I automatically categorize some of those sensations and perceptions that I'm having as being associated with what I've called me, and some not. Now, the process of doing that, this is something that I was talking to you about yesterday, which I think is so vital and something that's never talked about on film or in books or in anything, which is that the process of sitting and experimenting and experiencing this over time collapses the amount of time that the conditioning operates in me. In other words, the first time I sit here and I experience the sound of the fan as being remote, and the sensation inside my hand as being closer to me than that, it may take me 15, 20 minutes of just sitting in the presence of that before all of a sudden it becomes very clear that all of these sensations and perceptions that are occurring are actually occurring in exactly the same space. As I continue to do that exercise, day in and day out, moment to moment, and whenever I can afford to focus my attention in that manner, that period of time between the conditioned response of here and there and the experience of everything's happening at one place gets shorter and shorter. And this is something that I've never heard anyone talking about, but it's almost like deprogramming.
Yes, what's important to make clear is that experience is always already what it is, irrespective of our interpretation of it. And what we come to realize is actually that the sound of the fan and the bodily sensation have always been in the same place and made out of the same stuff. So what we're doing is not in any way manipulating or changing experience. All we're doing is looking at it. As you said, we're just sitting with it. In a sense, we're allowing the nature of experience to reveal itself. We're separating out the experience itself from the mental commentary. There's the experience itself, and then there's the label that says, this bodily sensation is closer to me than the sound of the fan. And in fact, even before that happens, there is a label which says that I am this body. And then the second interpretation is, not only am I this body, this is closer to me than... This consciousness has never been exclusively associated with the body. The sound of the fan has never been further from it than this. So nothing really changes in this. All that's happening is that the nature of experience is becoming more and more obvious. And as you say, when we experiment to begin with, it may take some time because the conditioning is so strong. The experience and the commentary are so close, they're almost
Identical.
identical.
When you start.
It takes some time to separate out. It's like salad dressing. We think it's one material. the fact itself, the experience itself, and the interpretation which says, I am closer.
Further, right.
Yes. And we just sit with that, and they slowly separate. We take the oil, the interpretation, and we put it on one side. We just put it out and just stay with the sensation and allow the obviousness of the actual experience. So it's not that we suddenly have a new experience and think, wow, that's an amazing new experience. No, we just think, oh my goodness, of course. It's so obvious. The sound is inseparable from the presence which hears it. It's one, exactly the same way that the bodily sensation, when it is present. So we sit with our experience. We simply sit with it, and we allow it to reveal itself as it is. We put the interpretation, the mind's interpretation, on one side. We don't have to get rid of the interpretation.
Right.
We don't have to destroy it. It's useful. But it's an interpretation. And we just let the fact of the experience speak for itself. And as we do that, to begin with, the interpretation seems to be an inherent part of the experience itself. But if we're very, very simple, very, very childlike, and we just sit with the experience, the raw facts, the sound and the sensation, we put them both in front of us, and we experience just the raw experience itself, it becomes very clear that the sound is at the same distance from the perceiving consciousness as the bodily sensation is. And that distance is no distance at
Zero.
all. Try to find, ask yourself the question, is there more space between me, that is me, this perceiving consciousness, and a bodily sensation, than between me, this perceiving consciousness, and the sound of the fan? Do I have an actual experience of a greater distance between I as consciousness and the sound than we do between I and consciousness and the sensation? What is our experience? What is that distance? There's no distance. It is one.
Right. There is no boundary, there is no border, there is no space.
Yes.
They are the same. They are integral.
However, when the sound is present and when the bodily sensation is present, its presence is one with that which knows it. There is no space, there is no distance between that which knows and that which is known. There is no distance between me and the bodily sensation or the sound. When I say me, I mean me as consciousness. They are one experience.
You have mentioned before this process as one of labeling, which is interesting. I've heard people talk about Namaropa, which is an Indian tradition, but I mean this idea of labeling, it's almost as if there is a inherent part of the mental process of creating this space, which along with the perception of the sensation somehow categorizes it into the feeling that things are distant, closer, further, me, not me, etc., and so forth. And this is so far beyond just the intellectual understanding of what's going on. This seems to be how the operation of the mechanics of how I perceive sensation is going, that the moment of quietness is the only time you can really see the fact that this interpretation is actually, it's like a superimposition. It's something that happens after the fact. And I guess in some senses you're saying it's helpful. You just put it off to the side because, frankly, it would be a little bit difficult having a business life without using this thing to be able to coordinate with other people. But in actuality, it's something that appears to happen after the fact, above and beyond that which is already here in order to...
Yes. The mind appears to divide what is, the seamless oneness of what is, in any moment, into separate parts. The initial division that it seems to make is the division into a separate subject and a separate object. It seems to divide experience into a located entity that perceives and a distant world that is perceived. Prior to that, every appearance is one with that which experiences it. Nothing can appear without consciousness. Whatever appears, its appearance is absolutely one with consciousness. Nothing is closer or further away to consciousness. There is the totality of experience, right, and every part of it is permeated by consciousness. In fact, consciousness is the substance of every part of it, no matter how far away it seems to be. Does it make sense to say that this chair is any closer to the space in this room than the carpet? Or that the carpet is any closer to the space in this room than the ceiling? It's absurd. Right. Everything is equidistant, which is no distance at all. It's within the space of this room. And then this is where the metaphor fails. It's not only within the space of this room, but the substance of whatever appears in consciousness is made out of consciousness. So the primal experience is always that there is this seamless totality, this seamless oneness. And the mind is itself an expression of this seamless oneness. However, the mind, as it were, is like a filter that appears within this seamless oneness and fragments it, first of all, into two things, a subject and an object. And then it further subdivides the object into 10,000 things.
Right.
So we're left with a model of an individual entity perceiving 10,000
right,
separate objects. The mind is like a screen that
yeah,
appears to fragment. However, having said that, the mind itself is an appearance of the totality. So it never truly divides anything, even when it seems to divide experience and then gives an incorrect interpretation of that experience. Even that incorrect interpretation is ultimately right, an expression of the totality. Hence, ignorance is never really ignorant. Ignorance is an illusion, but it's a very powerful illusion. So all we're doing here is just allowing experience to reveal itself as it is. There's no attempt here to change, to manipulate experience, to get rid of suffering, to become enlightened. It's nothing to do with any of that. It's just allowing experience itself to reveal itself to itself as it is.
So this same experiment that we started with, of listening to the fan, of acknowledging both the sound of the fan and the bodily sensation in the hand, for the purposes of being able to determine whether or not they're occurring in the same space or not, can then be extended into absolutely everything that's occurring within our awareness, every sensation, every perception, every thought, and every image that's going on. Now, there's a tremendous amount of stuff going on at any given time. Your voice is coming off, my hand is feeling this way, my foot's feeling that way, the guy's walking across the set, the sound of the fan, the beads on my thing. There are all this different stuff. And I guess as a function of being present and aware in the moment, and that functionality happening as a result of the exercise of listening first to the sensation and the sound and realizing they're occurring in exactly the same place. They're not occurring in different places. Suddenly, I start perceiving differently and realizing that all the perceptions, all the sensations, all the images, all the thoughts, everything is appearing within the same awareness.
Yes. This example that we took of the fan and the bodily sensation is a little bit artificial. We abstracted one sound and one sensation, just in order to be clear and simple. Of course, that's never the case. There is, as you say,
A deafening roar.
yes, but in fact, if we look closely, that is just another interpretation. There are not 10,000 things going on. We don't have to examine every little salt and pepper pot, every book, every CD, every piece of furniture, every sound, Once we've got the key, once we've, in a slightly artificial way that we've done now, abstracted one experience, in this case a sound, and seen, yes, that sound takes place in the same placeless place as the bodily sensation. We don't have to go through every single object because there is only one experience. When you look at an image on the screen, how many screens are you looking at? One screen. It may appear that there are 10,000 objects on the screen, but it's always one screen. Likewise, there is always only one experience going on. We never experience 10,000 things. We never experience two things. Non-duality, ad vita, not two. There are never two things present, let alone 10,000 things present. There is always only the seamless totality of experience.
Right. I've been sort of walking, though, along this path of experimentation as I stand back from the isolated experience that we started, this artificial isolated experience, and allow for the totality of the sensations and perceptions that I'm seeing to all appear in the same space. There is a tangible experience of expansion and also of awareness that everything is arising within me.
Yes. To begin with, it feels like there's an expansion, but that's only because we're so accustomed to living in the body. We feel expanded. We suddenly feel that we expand into this vast space because we had previously shrunk ourselves. Actually, we never go anywhere. Consciousness is never shrunk into a body. That's just a filter that the mind places over experience to make the oneness of experience look like two things. But it never becomes two things. Consciousness never becomes anything other than itself. The totality of experience is never fragmented into a subject and an object, let alone into 10,000 things. But it seems to be.
Well, the experience of it being maybe different than the actuality of it. And maybe the experience of it seeming different only because of the phenomenon of feeling contracted for so long that the actual relaxation or the allowing of things to be as they are feels as though we're expanding in every direction.
When we've been used to being a separate entity, it feels that we expand into this great expanse of awareness. But it then, at some stage, it turns around and we realize that actually we have always been only ever this dimensionless expanse of awareness, and that whatever appears, whatever it is, whether it's a bodily sensation or a perception of a distant star, always appears one with this knowing presence that we are. So it becomes more and more natural to just simply be as we are, to own ourselves, to be this knowing presence, and to feel that whatever is appearing is its expression, is made out of it.
just said in one sentence as a description of what the book is, which is such a mind blower because it would be the culmination of the entire teaching, which is the flow that happens from consciousness being aware of objects appearing to it. From that phase to consciousness becoming aware of all objects appearing within it. And I think what I keep hearing you circle back into is the beauty, which is the final key, which is that in the final analysis, the consciousness, in fact, is it.
Yes. In order to establish the presence and the primacy of consciousness, we separate it, so to speak, from the objects of the body, mind, and the world. And we say, I'm not the body because I perceive the body. I'm not the mind because I perceive the mind. I'm not the world because I perceive the world. In the traditional teaching, it's the position of the witness. Consciousness knows itself as the witness of all objects. So the subject of experience is no longer the body-mind, and the object is no longer the world. Now the subject is this witnessing presence of consciousness, and the object is the body-mind world. That's a very valid and useful tool because it establishes that what I am is consciousness. Because there is still a big unanswered question in this position. Okay, yes, that makes sense, I'm consciousness. But what about me as consciousness with these objects? There is still a duality.
Yeah.
Yes, the subject is now impersonal consciousness, not a personal body-mind. But nevertheless, it is still a position in which there is a subject and an object. So the understanding that I am this witnessing consciousness is true in relation to the previous understanding that I am this body-mind. But it's only partially true, and it turns out to be untrue or not completely true in face of a deeper investigation into our experience. So if we go from the experience that the objects of the body, mind, and world appear to this consciousness, and then we say, okay, if that's true, where does the body, mind, and world end, and the consciousness to which they appear begin? What we're saying is that this hand is like consciousness, and the chair is the world. It appears to it. Now, is that true? If it's true, there must be an experience of the limit of consciousness. This was the experience we went through earlier, the same experiment we went through earlier. The same experiment applies here, that if we look for that boundary, we don't find it. If we look for a limit to consciousness, we can't find it. If we think that we find a limit to consciousness, we only have to ask ourselves the question, okay, if this is the limit in our experience to consciousness, what is my experience of that which is beyond this limit? In just the same way that we see what is beyond that window, so what is our experience of that which is beyond and outside consciousness? By definition, there isn't anything, because whatever is experienced is by definition within. So it becomes obvious. That's the intellectual understanding. It becomes obvious there cannot be anything
And that's very
outside.
helpful.
So now, with that understanding, we check it out. Do we feel that? So we can take any experience, the sound of the traffic,
sound of my voice, the
the
sound
sound
of
of your voice, and apply that theory. Is it true? And we just stay. Again, you stay with your experience. Don't allow the mind to come in and commentate. Don't even allow the mind to come in and say, this is taking place within you. By thinking in this way, we've got rid of the old certainty that something appears outside consciousness. We don't need to replace it with a new certainty. All that happens now is that we're open at a deeper level to the facts of our experience. So we just sit with our experience again, and it becomes more and more obvious that yes, the sound of the fan appears in this perceiving consciousness. And it takes, in most cases, it takes even more time to see that that's true of a visual impression. So then we can now reformulate our experience that objects, that is the mind, the body, and the world, don't just appear to consciousness, they appear in consciousness.
Right.
So now the formulation that objects appear to consciousness is, although it was true in relation to the statement that objects appear to the body-mind, it's now not true in the face of this new formulation, this new understanding that objects appear in consciousness. Right. The bodily sensations, the visual perceptions, everything appears in. So now there is still some duality. There is still some apparent duality. Okay, it's true, everything appears inside consciousness in just the same way that this chair appears inside this space. However, we could make a good case still for this chair, albeit within consciousness, but it's somehow still an object. Right. There is still, yes, the subject is now vast, it is presence, the object is now tiny, it appears within, but there is still the sense that it is an object, distinct from and separate from. So then again, we just go more deeply. We don't go more deeply into the experience. We allow the experience of the object to reveal itself more deeply. Ask yourself, take the experience, let's stay with the sound of the fan. Establish in your experience that that sound is taking place within you, inside this perceiving consciousness. And then ask yourself, what is the substance out of which this sound is made? What is the difference between the experience of the sound and the transparent experience of consciousness? Are there two different substances present in this experience? You sit very intimately, bring the sound of the fan, bring it right in, feel it intimately that it's taking place inside you. And see that this sound is completely saturated in and permeated with that which hears it, with this hearing, knowing presence. See that that's a fact of your experience, that there is no other substance to the sound than the hearing of it, than the consciousness of it, than the experiencing of it. There are not two things present. There is nothing solid. There is nothing other about the sound. It is completely one with. In fact, we shouldn't even have two names for them now, consciousness plus the sound. They are one substance. We could call it experiencing.
It's almost a coloring of consciousness.
Beautiful, yes, exactly. It's just like the faintest tint of apparent objectivity, that this empty space just, it's like a current within the ocean, made out of nothing but water, just the slightest sense of consciousness taking the shape of, or being coloured. That's a very nice way of putting it. And now, as we allow this experience to become more and more obvious, we can say to ourselves, well, how did this sound, where did it come from? This sound that appeared within consciousness. What was the actual experience? For instance, which was there first? Consciousness
or the sound?
Mm-hmm. Obviously, consciousness was there, because before the fan was turned on, consciousness was still here, experiencing whatever. So, if we abide knowingly as this consciousness, and we experience the appearance of the sound, we see that it's not that the sound appears within consciousness, it's that consciousness is the primary element of the experience, and it is consciousness that takes the shape of the sound. So truly there is nothing other in our experience than consciousness taking the shape of the totality of whatever it is.
Of all the perceptions and sensations.
Yes, and that's true not only of a sound, but it's true a perception.
Well, this is where I was going to say, this gets to be a little harder to swallow if I think about a chair. But if I stand back and go, I'm not experiencing a chair, I'm experiencing a perception of a chair. And what am I actually experiencing when I experience this thing that I call chair? Now you're into the realm of being able to see what I'm calling chair appears within consciousness, and then what are the characteristics of chair in relation to consciousness.
The chair consists of two things. One, a texture, and two, a visual perception. If we repeat the experiment, we could separate them out. We do it with the texture of the chair. We will find out exactly the same thing is true of the texture of the chair. It appears in the same placeless place of consciousness and is made out of exactly the same transparent substance that consciousness is made of. And then we do it with a perception, and it's more difficult sometimes with the perception. The actual perception, we do the same experiment, exactly the same thing. It becomes obvious that the same thing is true.
Give me an example of what you mean by perception as opposed to...
A visual perception. The house on the hill over there. Mm-hmm. If we, first of all, abstract it from any interpretation, take away any interpretation and sit with the raw experience, just like we did with the fan, or like we did with the bodily sensation or the texture, we do the same thing with any visual perception.
Right.
Slowly, in most cases, it will become clearer and clearer that the visual perception appears in exactly the same place as every other sensation, thought, image, or perception, and is made out of the same stuff.
There appears to be greater weight given to visual input than auditory input.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes.
And so let's see if we can investigate a little bit about the nature of, even in the context of the experiments that you and I have been doing, frequently we say, let's close our eyes. Because it simplifies it so that it's easier to see. When you open your eyes, you're adding a whole nother layer and
Yes.
element. This, by the way, your ability to see this explains a tremendous amount to me about your art and your ability as an artist. Your ability to see, because it's reflected in every single thing that you create. When I first saw your work, I just sat there, I said, this is unbelievable, because it was such an expression of the visual nature of consciousness and how it interacts with space and form.
Yeah.
So let's just talk about what's going on visually and what's going on with respect to consciousness and what appears visually to us. You know, because we hear endlessly the discussion of this and we seem to skip across it like a needle across a record.
Yes.
And we get from point A to Z. And I'm not at all convinced that most of the people follow the whole ride through and spend the time taking a look. Okay, we've pretty much explored the whole issue of sound. Let's explore now for a minute the whole issue of vision.
I think you're quite right to spend time here, Chris, because the sense of separation is at its most persuasive in the visual realm. The experiments that we've done with sounds, textures, we haven't done it with tastes and smells, thoughts, but as we do this experiment with those aspects of our experience, and it becomes more and more obvious that, at least with our eyes closed, the substance of every experience is only ever consciousness. Then, at least that's given us a key. We know how to explore our experience, and we can then apply the same experiment. And by experiment, all we're really talking about is just being with our experience, when we're not doing anything to our experience.
Yeah.
So we can do the same thing with the visual realm and first establish ourselves in the feeling understanding that everything takes place within and is an expression of that which knows it. And then in the visual realm, it's the same experience, it's the same experiment of sitting with our experience of a visual perception and allowing the obviousness that it is one with consciousness to become clear. Even in the normal physical model of reality, we know that when we look at an object, all we're seeing is light.
It's easy to fall into the scientific explanation about photons and how nothing that you're perceiving is actually what you think you're
No, but
perceiving.
let's not go there because
I understand. I understand. This is a much more experiential way, right?
I don't want to go into theory, or if we're going to theorize, I want the theory to be based on
I
experience.
agree with you,
So of course
absolutely.
we're theorizing in the sense that we're using words, and all words are abstract. So we're theorizing by definition, but the theories that we're coming up with are derived from experience. They're not derived from other theories. So we can see, it's our experience, we can see, for instance, that all we're seeing now is made out of light. There is nothing inherent, for instance, in the experience of that wall that tells us that it is solid. Because our only experience of that wall at the moment is light.
Right.
So we can see that it's our actual experience that all we're seeing is light. We just ask ourselves, if we were to take light out of the current experience, what would happen to the objects? They would vanish. So go more deeply, go down that track, but go more deeply into that experience and see that without consciousness, the current visual perception would vanish utterly if we were to take consciousness out. That wherever we see a visual object, consciousness is one with it. Yes? Let's abstract the tree on the hill over there. Mm-hmm. When we see the tree is one with the consciousness that perceives it. We've already come in our experience to the understanding that consciousness is not located anywhere, that it has no dimensions. So if we know that about consciousness, and we know also from our own experience that the tree, when it is present, is one with consciousness. That also means that wherever consciousness is, the tree is. Whatever consciousness is, the tree is there too.
Right. When I sit with the experience of sound as appearing within consciousness, it becomes very clear that consciousness is the sound, that at most sound is a coloring of that same consciousness. Then in anything that comes in visually, I have the same element of consciousness
Yes.
interacting with something which is a play of light. And it's just a play of light and darkness coloring the same consciousness. Now this, I know to most people, is really very difficult, but
We can't go and grab this experience. The non-dual experience, we can't go after it. It's an experience that reveals itself to itself. And instead of going out and trying to find out how it is that the visual realm is one, it's actually the opposite of trying to grasp the experience. It's a very, very deep relaxation. It's a falling away of all the layers of conceptual thinking that we superimpose upon our experience that make it feel separate, distant, other. As this relaxation takes place, the obviousness, the self-evident nature of experience, it comes in from the background, so to speak, of our experience. These experiments or explorations of experience that we've been doing, in a sense, they dismantle the old certainties, the old ways of seeing, and they allow experience to reveal itself as it is. And sometimes this happens unsolicited, just like that. We all know examples, but in most cases it doesn't. In most cases, if there is a deep belief and feeling that what we are is separate, in most cases this investigation and exploration takes place, and slowly experience is relieved of its apparent dual nature, of its apparent otherness. And experience is known and felt to be more and more obviously what it always already is.
What is interesting is that we started this whole idea about what was fact and what was belief. And one of the first statements that we talked about was that I'm born and that I die and that I'm a man or I'm a woman. And it was outrageous to us in the beginning of this conversation to even consider the fact that this may not be a fact, that it may be a belief. To me, this whole process is one of uncovering the fact. The reason we don't experience reality is because the beliefs go all the way down to our core way that we sense what's going on.
Yes, the reason we don't seem to experience reality.
Right. The idea that what I'm seeing here is a three-dimensional and separate object, okay? And not a movement in consciousness, not a collection and movement in consciousness, is only due to another layer, a deeper layer of beliefs that remains to be investigated.
Yes.
And I'm not so sure that that is a conscious effort as much as it is at some point, and you've mentioned this a couple of times, an allowing. You start this as sort of a doing, and at some point along the way, it's not a doing anymore. It's something that's being done. It's an allowing. It's letting whatever it is unfold.
If we have this deep conviction, a conviction made of beliefs and feelings, that what we are is a person, then you're absolutely right. It appears that this process is a doing, is something we do in order to achieve something. That's the way it appears, and that's fine. If we feel that we're a person, it is inevitable that it's going to appear as a doing. And the reason is this, that when any activity, when any action takes place, there is just the activity itself. There is just the raw facts of the experience. The mind then comes in after the action and claims. And with that claim, the separate entity is created. I saw, I felt, I enjoyed, I did, I suffered, I became. The mind commentates on the experience. And in that moment, it creates the separate self. But the separate self has many hats. And one of the hats is, I am the doer. So as long as there is a feeling of being a separate self, inherent in that position is that I am a doer. The belief and feeling that I'm a separate entity is the same belief and feeling that I am the doer. We cannot legitimately say, I feel that I'm a person, but I don't think I'm a doer. There's nothing to do. It's a mutually exclusive position. And if we take that position, it's disingenuous. If we know that we are consciousness, that consciousness takes the shape of the totality of our experience, then the question of whether there's something to do or not, it just doesn't arise. However, if we don't know that, if we think we're a separate entity, then being a doer is inherent in that position. And it would be more honest to say, yes, I feel I'm a person, and to understand very clearly that if we feel we are a person, we feel we are a doer. And therefore we feel there is something to be done. What we then do is to explore the nature of this so-called doer. And we discover that there is no such thing. Then it becomes obvious that there is no doer. Therefore, the question of whether there is something to do or whether there is not something to do becomes as absurd as discussing whether there is something for the pink elephant under your chair to do or not to do. Both the statement that there is something for the elephant to do and the statement that there is nothing for the elephant to do are equally absurd. Both of them are untrue. So the issue is not whether or not there is something to do, it's whether or not there is someone to do it. And if we think that that someone is in place, then the investigation of that one, if we're trying to explore the nature of reality, exploring that one that is the doer is necessary. Of course, when we explore it thoroughly, like we've been doing, we discover that it is non-existent, that it has never been there. Then, of course, there is nothing to do, but then there's nothing to discuss about it. It becomes obvious that it's not there.
It's almost as that awareness grows, though, the unfolding process is allowed to proceed. You're available to understand.
Yes.
You're not acting in any way resisting to what is anymore.
Yes. This investigation that takes place and the exploration that takes place at the level of the body, the investigation that takes place at the level of the mind, we may think that there is a doer, somebody doing it, but we discover that there was never anybody doing it. There's never anybody doing anything. It doesn't mean that all action ceases. No, cars continue to be driven, meals continue to be cooked. Inquiring into the nature of experience continues to be undertaken. Everything continues, but it doesn't imply that there's a doer. And it's possible for this investigation into the nature of experience to carry on without there being any sense of a doer.
It's one movement.
Yes.
That's remarkable. So we've sort of come a little bit of a way here from aggressively resisting the idea that we're a man or a woman, or that we're born or we die, all the way through a plateau of exploring what does it mean to say that consciousness is personal. I mean, what does that even mean? To a point where it really becomes clear that by saying that something is impersonal does not mean that it's not intimate. It's very intimate. It's probably the most intimate thing in the world. It's just not personal.
Yes.
And that absolutely nothing is personal.
Yes.
And that ultimately the awareness, maybe that the awareness comes as a lack of resistance or surrender of resistance to everything that is, that you're seeing. Finally, just saying, whatever is, let me see it as it is.
Yes. We say that consciousness is impersonal in order to make it clear that consciousness is not personal. But then, once we've used the idea that consciousness is impersonal to see through the false certainty that we once had that consciousness is personal, we no longer have to have the idea that consciousness is impersonal. Ultimately, we can't say anything about consciousness other than that it is. It defies any description of the mind. So even these statements, which are perhaps more true than the ones they've replaced, for instance, that consciousness is impersonal rather than personal, yes, it's more true in relation to the previous statement. But still, even to say that consciousness is impersonal is to say too much. In the end, once we've come to that understanding, once we've seen through the false so-called understanding that consciousness was personal, we no longer need to hold on to the formulation that consciousness is impersonal. It's done its job. We can then go even further back and realize that actually there's nothing we can say with the mind. If we can say anything at all, we can just say, it is. But even it, to say it, is too much. And to say it is too much because of the subtle implication that there is something which is not. So even to say it is too much. Parmenides, the Greek philosopher, that said, that which is never ceases to be, and that which is not never comes into being. So, even when we say it is, there's a subtle implication that something that is not is possible. But if all there is what is, then we don't need to state it. We can't frame it. There's no need at all to formulate this. Simply we're left with pure experience. And that experience is the totality from moment to moment. Of course, it can be formulated provisionally, if necessary, as it has been done in our conversation, for the purposes of exploring experience. But then, when we've explored it and we've gone back and back and back, as far as we can go back in our experience, to the raw substance of experience, it leaves us silent. It just leaves us open, empty, silent, available, experiencing the totality of experience as ourself from moment to moment. Nothing else needs to be done to that. It's a position of simplicity, ease, friendliness, lack of resistance. I'm saying too much.
Right.
I'd just add one thing to that, that we often hear in contemporary Advaita that all there is what is. And I think this is misunderstood sometimes, that it doesn't mean that all there is the sights, the sounds, the feelings, the textures that's going on. It doesn't mean that. That is a position of solipsism. It's a form of delusion. All that is the content of this mind. All it is just this current experience. There's a confusion there between non-duality and solipsism. They are not the same. They're very, very different. Solipsism says the content of this mind is all there is. These objects, these sensations, these sounds, these textures, these visual impressions. It's a form of madness. It's delusion. In non-duality, we hear the expression, there is only what is. But here, what is doesn't refer to objects. It refers to presence.
Phenomena, right.
It means all that is this luminous, transparent presence, taking the shape from moment to moment of the totality of experience. Ramana Maharshi described it another way beautifully. He said, only that which is present in deep sleep is real. In every experience, that which is present in deep sleep is pure consciousness. And in every experience, it is only this pure consciousness that takes the shape of the totality of our experience and yet always remains itself. That is what is. Presence. Only presence is. Only consciousness is.